My childhood sweetheart, perfectly suited for me, chose to be with a fragile girl from the impoverished areas. Determined to marry her, he endured tremendous pressure from his entire family and ended our engagement. Devastated, I left the country to pursue further education. By the time I came back, he and Carolina had been married for almost 2 years, and I had already moved on. At the grand welcome back party organized in my honor, Patrick, who had once gone against everything to be with Carolina, now gazed at her with icy eyes and contempt. In a cold voice, he remarked, "Aren't you meant to stay home? Why are you here embarrassing yourself?" Upon my return, my friends threw a lavish welcome party for me. Surprisingly, Patrick was in attendance. 7 years earlier, he had insisted on ending our engagement despite our families being well matched, choosing Carolina instead. He had even declared before our elders that he'd rather marry a dog than remain with me if he couldn't be with Carolina. His harsh words disregarded the long-standing friendship between our families. That day, I couldn't hold back anymore. I cried for an hour in front of my parents, pleading to end the engagement. I told them I no longer wanted Patrick or to marry him. With sorrow in their eyes, my parents eventually agreed, meeting privately with Patrick's family for an hour. It turned out that the issue wasn't Patrick wanting to leave me, but my family not wanting to see their daughter married off. The engagement was eventually canceled, and though our families remained in contact, our relationship slowly faded. Later, I pursued my studies in Paris. Now, back home, I observed Patrick closely. He had grown taller and more refined, his handsome face carrying an air of dignified detachment. His dark eyes were fixed on me. No one had informed me that Patrick would attend. I glanced at Jessica, the event host, who quickly distanced herself, explaining, "I didn't invite him, Sophia. Lee somehow heard you were returning and took the initiative to organize this party for me. It wasn't intentional." She nervously added, trying to deflect responsibility. Patrick, with a gentle smile reminiscent of his school days when he used to pick me up, said, "Sophia, it's been so long. I was young and foolish back then and hurt you. I'm here to apologize." He paused, locking eyes with me. His phrasing suggested that if I admitted holding a grudge, I might be the one unable to move on. I lifted my chin and smiled warmly. "As you said, it's all in the past. We're still part of the same social circle, and it's been years. You no longer matter to me." I decided to let bygones be bygones, at least outwardly. I took a sip of wine and casually remarked, "Jessica mentioned you and Carolina got married over a year ago. I haven't congratulated you yet, so here's to you." His face remained impassive. Considering he had married the woman he deeply desired, even someone as reserved as him should show some emotion. Before I could think further, he raised his glass and drank. It seemed less like a toast and more like he was trying to numb his feelings. I didn't dwell on it. As old friends and acquaintances mingled, the conversation naturally centered around me. Questions about my boyfriends in France, my international art exhibition tour, and playful complaints like, "Sophia, you're so successful. Your exhibitions always sell out, and you've opened numerous galleries worldwide. My dad is always disappointed, telling me to learn from you instead of chasing celebrities, shopping for bags, and buying sports cars." I laughed it off, replying, "It's just a hobby." Patrick, who had been quiet, suddenly laughed. "You've definitely become more humble over the years." His tone was, how can I describe it? It felt as natural as if we were still old friends, as if he hadn't said or done those hurtful things when he chose Carolina. I wasn't sure how to respond. Maybe it was my imagination, but there seemed to be a hint of something more in his voice. Something almost flirtatious. Before I could respond, he added, "I saw your dream of samsara. It was fantastic." At this moment, not only I, but also my friends noticed something was off. Conversations hushed, and everyone's eyes subtly shifted between Patrick and me. I maintained a composed expression and thanked him politely. After a brief pause, I teased him, "Did you attend with Carolina? By the way, why didn't she come today? It's been years since I last saw her. After all, we were classmates." His demeanor turned distant again as he casually responded, "Oh, She had something to attend to at home. His tone made her seem like a stranger. I couldn't understand why he spoke about the woman he once loved so passionately with such detachment, but I chose not to engage further. I laughed it off and changed the topic. As the evening drew to a close, we saw Carolina sitting alone on a couch in the lobby as we were leaving the club. Her eyes were fixed on the private VIP elevator, her expression tense and anxious. When the elevator doors opened, she immediately stood up from the couch, seemingly waiting for us to exit. Everyone paused for a moment. She attempted a smile, her gaze sweeping the room until it settled on me beside Patrick. Her face turned pale instantly. She stood there, staring at me with a lost and forlorn look, as if facing a formidable foe. I was perplexed. Carolina had changed so much. I remembered the first time she joined our class during the second semester of high school. Back then, she wore the school uniform, standing on the podium looking malnourished, her clothes loosely hanging on her frame. Her features were plain and unremarkable, and her face showed signs of nervousness and discomfort. However, the homeroom teacher greeted her warmly, saying, "This is Carolina, who always excels in the provincial joint exams. Let's welcome her." Silence fell as curious eyes turned to Carolina. We attended a prestigious private high school where students were either wealthy or noble, and academic excellence wasn't the sole criterion for admission. Carolina's appearance didn't quite fit in. I felt a bit sorry for her at the time, so I smiled and was the first to applaud. Reluctantly, the class began clapping, the sound filling every corner of the room. The homeroom teacher thanked me and introduced me to Carolina. "This is Sophia Jing, the class monitor. If you need any help, feel free to ask her." Despite this, Carolina never reached out to me for assistance because Patrick was there to protect her. Patrick, who was my boyfriend then. When Carolina transferred, the only available seat was next to Patrick, making her his desk mate. I don't know if their betrayal of my feelings started from that moment. For example, Carolina came from a poor background and suffered from severe hypoglycemia and anemia. One morning during self-study, she fainted, and it was Patrick who carried her to the infirmary. Or when Aunt Lee returned from Belgium with many gifts for Patrick and me. When she asked me to choose first, Patrick took out a box of handmade chocolates and said, "I'll take this." I was confused because Patrick didn't have a sweet tooth, and I had never seen him particularly fond of chocolates. Later, he even requested my family's pastry recipes. Finding it inconvenient, I had our chef prepare them and send them directly to him. I thought Patrick had developed a new taste, until I later saw candy wrappers on Carolina's desk, alongside the pastries I had sent to Patrick. Carolina had a genuine love for chocolates and a strong craving for pastries. I reassured myself that Patrick was simply showing concern for his unfortunate deskmate, despite Patrick not being the type to willingly assist others. It wasn't that I entirely dismissed my doubts, but Carolina seemed too unremarkable to warrant such attention. I never imagined that Patrick would turn against me and develop feelings for Carolina. After all, I considered myself exceptional. I was known as the most beautiful girl in the entire school, and some friends affectionately nicknamed me Three Goods. Not due to my personality, but because of my good family background, excellent grades, and popularity. How could I have thought that Patrick would deceive me and fall for Carolina? However, 7 years have passed, and Carolina no longer appears fragile and dowdy. She now dresses in high-fashion outfits from head to toe, carrying designer bags adorned with large logos. Although expensive, the accessories look somewhat gaudy and mismatched on her. She approached me with a smile and greeted, "Sophia, you're back." After speaking, her eyes lingered uncertainly between Patrick and me, casting a probing glance that made me uneasy. I frowned slightly, feeling irritated. Patrick was the first to respond, his tone detached. "Why are you here?" Carolina nervously glanced at Patrick, her smile turning somewhat sorrowful as she tried to appease him. "I was out shopping, and the club owner mentioned that you and your friends were hosting a welcome party for Sophia, so I waited to join you." Her explanation was full of inconsistencies. She then lifted her bag to show Patrick, saying, "The manager here heard I was here and specially sent 2 bottles of red wine as a gift for Mrs. Lee and Mr. Lee." She emphasized Mrs. Lee, as if claiming ownership. But Patrick's previously indifferent expression darkened with annoyance upon hearing this. I heard a friend behind me stifle a laugh. Considering the Lee family's status, not only the club manager, but even the owner would need to book an appointment half a month in advance just to see Patrick. Yet here was Patrick's wife treating 2 bottles of wine from a manager as something precious and presenting them to Patrick as if they were special. It was rather unsophisticated and inappropriate. Clearly, such awkward situations had likely occurred multiple times since Carolina and Patrick got married. Patrick's voice was impatient and blunt. "Didn't I tell you to stay at home? Why did you come out and embarrass yourself?" Laughter erupted from behind me. Carolina's once pale face turned ashen as she looked helplessly at Patrick. She couldn't understand why Patrick was suddenly angry, nor did she know what she had done wrong. No one had explained it to her or guided her. Everyone was mocking her lack of sophistication and her inability to fit in. But Patrick's demeanor took me by surprise, and I instinctively turned to look at him. His expression was icy, unaffected by the low murmurs of laughter around us, as if the person being ridiculed wasn't the woman he had struggled so hard to marry. I was momentarily stunned. He hadn't acted like this before. When Carolina was ostracized by the class for not fitting in, Patrick, who eventually ended our engagement for her, always stood up for her and protected her, but now he stood there looking down at Carolina with cold eyes, showing a barely noticeable weariness and impatience in his gaze. He seemed entirely different from the man he once was. How could he resent Carolina? Had he forgotten how fiercely he had once defended her, even to the point of breaking off our engagement? The first time Patrick defended Carolina was during an English class. For us, English was probably the easiest subject. Since we were 2 years old, we had several live-in English tutors at home, and all our daily conversations were in English. From grammar to pronunciation, we spoke with the precision of British aristocrats. This was one of the fundamental skills we were expected to master. That day, the English teacher asked Carolina to read a passage aloud. As soon as she stood up and began, the class started to buzz. By the time she was halfway through, someone couldn't contain themselves and started laughing. Although her grades were undeniably good, she likely hadn't received a structured education, and her pronunciation was awkward, filled with embarrassing mistakes. The laughter was contagious, growing into a loud uproar until Carolina stood silently. The English teacher, looking somewhat helpless, asked her to sit down and tried to change the subject. After class, Jessica deliberately approached Carolina and loudly imitated her pronunciation while speaking English to her friends. She mimicked it so accurately that everyone nearby couldn't help but laugh. Carolina sat at her desk with her head down, her bangs covering her forehead. From my side view, I couldn't see her expression, but her silhouette appeared slender, her shoulders burdened with suppressed emotions. For some reason, I suddenly felt indifferent. I wanted to tell Jessica to stop bullying the new student, but before I could speak, Patrick, who usually avoided interfering in others' matters, acted first. He had been lying on his desk, napping, but upon hearing Jessica's mockery, he sat up without expression, grabbed the thick book in front of him, Harry Potter, and tapped it on the desk, the sound resonating clearly. Amid the tapping, he looked coldly at Jessica, who was teasing Carolina, and said sharply, "Shut up! You're being annoying." Jessica's laughter stopped, and the class fell silent. My gaze fixed on Patrick briefly before I turned to Jessica, offering a gentle smile to ease the awkwardness. I said, "Jessica, class is about to start." Jessica turned back, making a shushing gesture towards me, nodding, and led her friends back to their seats while obediently saying, "Got it." From the corner of my eye, I saw Carolina glance at Patrick, her eyes bright as she whispered something to him. I assumed she was probably thanking him, but Patrick's expression remained indifferent, showing no emotional response. Later, after lunch, I encountered Carolina again in the library. The library was least crowded at noon since most people were eating, napping, or gossiping about the latest news. She was sitting in a secluded corner by the window, and I overheard her struggling to practice her accent with a small speaker. I didn't pay much attention and lay down on the other side, ready to take a nap. Until I saw Patrick. He entered with his usual handsome, nonchalant demeanor, holding an English edition of Harry Potter. He walked straight to Carolina, stood beside her, and said, "Practicing like that won't help." Then he sat down next to her, casually opened his Harry Potter, pointed to a sentence, and said, "Read this to me." Encouraged by him, Carolina blushed and took her time to timidly and haltingly read aloud bit by bit. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside showed no signs of sleepiness. Patrick's fingertip rested on drifting, and I could hear him patiently teaching Carolina how to pronounce it with a proper British accent. The library was very quiet, with sunlight streaming through the large windows, illuminating tiny golden dust particles dancing in the air, while the two of them bathed in the sunlight like a painting. Of course, at this point, Carolina was merely passively receiving Patrick's help. But ultimately, I saw her gaze fixed on Patrick's face, her cheeks gradually reddening. Then, in a soft, envious voice, she said to Patrick, "I'm really envious of Sophia." What she envied was obvious. From that moment on, I began to dislike Carolina. Naturally, no one could tell that I disliked Carolina. I had always been calm and easygoing. Although my classmates admired me, I never engaged in forming cliques or isolating others. During a PE class tennis session where boys and girls were separated, I first set my sights on her. Everyone selected their partners, and predictably, Carolina was left without one. She remained in the center of the court, racket in hand, her cheeks flushed as she glanced around, looking both helpless and pitiable. I grinned, approached her, and offered my hand, saying, "Let's team up." She appeared taken aback, nearly overwhelmed, and mumbled, "Me?" I nodded with a smile, replying, "Yes, you." Her grateful smile in return reminded me of a scene I'd seen in the library with her and Patrick. As I walked away, I forced the smile off my face, hoping she could maintain it later. However, Carolina didn't return any of my serves. It was like a game of fetch. Each time I served, I aimed the ball just out of her reach. She dashed back and forth, managing only to pick up the balls while repeatedly apologizing. Sorry, I'm really bad at this." It wasn't until later, when more classmates gathered, that she realized I was intentionally making it difficult for her. Someone whispered behind me, "What's up with the school bell? She's never acted this way before." Another added, "When did the new girl offend her?" I feigned ignorance, continuing to serve challenging shots until Carolina tripped and fell trying to return one. I watched her clutch her swollen knee, smiling without any remorse, and apologized. "Oh, I'm really sorry." She kept her head down, whispering, It's okay." I replied warmly, "Your tennis skills are really lacking. During the group match later, please don't slow me down." Carolina struggled to rise, still apologizing as everyone observed the unfolding scene until Patrick intervened. He glanced at me, then took the racket from Carolina's tearful grip, looking at me with a cold demeanor. "Her tennis skills are poor, Sophia. Let me practice with you instead," he said with a smile. Patrick completely overshadowed me. To be honest, he used his left hand and had won the junior tennis championship at 12, whereas I had only trained for a few years, making our skills mismatched. I stubbornly played against him for half an hour, barely managing to return his serves. My focus remained fixed on Patrick, who showed no mercy. On the final shot, he served the ball so it brushed over the net and struck my knee, the same spot Carolina had injured. The pain was intense. If not for someone gasping and helping me up, I would have collapsed. Patrick remained indifferent, looking at me coldly and saying, "Sophia, with your skills, even without anyone holding you back, you wouldn't win." He then turned to Carolina, gestured for her to follow, and said, "Come on, let's go." Carolina looked at him as if he were a heroic prince coming to her rescue. She nodded obediently, saying, "Okay." Later, a few classmates escorted me to the infirmary. After applying some medicine, Jessica stayed by my side. Normally carefree, Jessica sensed something was wrong that day. She asked, "Sophia, is Patrick crazy?" At that moment, I couldn't have known, but his subsequent actions were truly insane. Now, it's laughable. Turns out he regrets it. It's absolutely ridiculous. Several days after the welcome banquet, Jessica finally mustered the courage to call me. She cautiously began, "Sophia, are you mad?" while mixing paint, but I casually responded, "Why would I be mad?" She paused, then sighed and asked, "Can I ask you something privately? Do you still have feelings for Patrick?" Her question stunned me, nearly causing me to fall off my chair. After regaining my composure, I looked at Jessica with a wry smile and asked, "What makes you think that? What did I do to give you that impression? Tell me quickly so I can correct it." She hesitated before saying, "Because it feels like Patrick regrets marrying Carolina. And before you left the country, Patrick asked me about you several times." She continued with some gossip I had missed. After I left the country heartbroken and angry to pursue my studies, despite my broken engagement with Patrick, Aunt Lee strongly opposed his relationship with Carolina. It turns out Patrick truly loved Carolina. He stayed in the country to attend university with her, and after graduating, left the Lee family, refusing their financial support, and starting his own business. Honestly, although we felt bad for you back then, we were also touched by how Patrick stood up for Carolina. It was true love, Jessica explained. Eventually, the Lee family couldn't resist Patrick any longer. Being their only son, they persisted for a year before agreeing to let him marry Carolina. On their wedding day, the Lee family's reputation was completely tarnished. Despite Carolina's humble background, her large family was eager to flaunt her achievement and invited distant relatives and neighbors. News spread that the Lynn family's daughter had married into a prestigious family, leading to a crowded wedding banquet. Patrick likely wanted to preserve Carolina's dignity in front of his family, so the tables weren't separated. The Lee family's relatives, business partners, and Carolina's relatives all mingled in the same hall, creating a loud and chaotic environment with people chatting loudly, children running around, and Carolina's parents proudly boasting about their daughter's marriage to the eldest son of the Lee family. It was said that one of Carolina's uncles, trying to impress, even made Patrick kneel and kowtow during a toast. Patrick, usually treated like a star who had only knelt at the Lee family's ancestral shrine, now had to bow before an outsider. That night, Aunt Lee was so furious she ended up in the hospital, marking the start of Patrick's marriage to Carolina. Afterward, the Lynn family frequently exploited Patrick's name for scams, and he had to navigate numerous difficult situations. Carolina's brother driving drunk and causing a fatal accident, her uncle purchasing a house, her aunt's children enrolling in schools, and her disabled father needing employment. These issues gradually eroded any affection Patrick had for Carolina until nothing remained. I listened without much interest and suddenly remembered when Patrick had stood before me, explaining why he fell in love with Carolina. He had said coldly and deliberately, "Sophia, you were born into a life where everything comes easily. But Carolina, who had nothing, took root in the soil and grew into something bright and resilient on her own. I truly love Carolina. I love her vitality and unyielding spirit." His words from back then lingered in my mind, but his admiration and love had nearly vanished. What had changed? Had Carolina's vitality diminished, or did her unyielding spirit no longer shine so brightly for him? It was utterly ridiculous. I abruptly cut Jessica off, my tone turning somewhat cold. I don't care about what's happening between him and Carolina. His issues are none of my business. I don't want to hear about them, and I'm not interested. Jessica, if you bring him up again, our friendship is over. Okay, Jessica quickly apologized. I won't mention it again. I just wanted what's best for you after all back then. She stopped herself, but I knew she was referring to how deeply I had loved Patrick. However, the past is like the wind. No one remains in love with a single person their entire life, especially not someone who has hurt them. I'm still willing to speak with Patrick now, but only because I'm gracious and dignified. As for him, he means nothing to me anymore. If possible, I'd prefer to have no association with Patrick and Carolina. But it seems that's just my wish. They don't feel the same way. I encountered Patrick at a business cocktail party. We find ourselves within the same social circle, making our encounters unavoidable from time to time. Feeling suffocated, I stepped out onto the terrace to get some fresh air when Patrick approached, holding a glass of red wine, and began engaging in light conversation. I responded distractedly until he finally shifted his gaze towards the distant, overlapping mountains, his expression tinged with profound sadness. After a long pause, he nervously asked, "Sophia, have you been well since living abroad these past few years?" I slightly turned my head towards him, offering a faint smile, and reminded him, "Patrick, you're married. Considering the moonlight and the setting, do you think it's appropriate to initiate this kind of discussion with your ex-fiancé?" My tone was far from courteous, but he merely smiled, seemingly unaffected, and replied, "It's just casual conversation between old friends. You're being overly sensitive, Sophia." I subtly countered, "Sorry, but you do have a history, don't you?" He paused, not showing any anger, but instead gave a bitter smile. Sighing, he turned back to the distant view and said, "I'm just so exhausted. Everyone understands why I'm tired. Patrick's choice in a wife has become a joke within our entire circle. It's rare to see someone mock the Lee family like this." Choosing not to extend the conversation, I calmly lifted my wine glass, preparing to leave. Before departing, I offered him a polite smile and remarked, "But you chose her yourself." Our paths crossed again at Aunt Lee's birthday celebration. Since my return to the country, Aunt Lee had frequently reached out to me. Although the bond between our families had gradually weakened over the years, some business ties remained, and Aunt Lee had always held me in high regard. While I could have ridiculed Patrick for betraying me, I couldn't decline Aunt Lee's invitation. She personally called me saying, "Sophia, Auntie's birthday is next Wednesday. Can you come? You've been away for 7 years without even a call. It's hard to refuse when an elder personally invites you." After hanging up, I went out to select an appropriate gift. It wasn't until I arrived at the Lee family residence that I sensed something was off. Aunt Lee's birthday gathering was intimate, with no outsiders, just some relatives from the Lee family. My presence felt somewhat out of place. I hesitated briefly, but Aunt Lee appeared genuinely pleased to see me. She was surrounded by female relatives of her age, Patrick's aunts and cousins, all familiar figures. Aunt Lee beckoned me over and invited me to sit beside her. I paused, not wanting to create a scene, so I maintained a smile as I approached and sat next to her. Carolina was nowhere to be seen. Aunt Lee gently held my hand, scrutinizing me, and for some reason, her eyes welled up with tears. Emotionally, she said, "This child has grown before my eyes, becoming more beautiful and remarkable each day." The people around her echoed her sentiments, showering me with compliments. As I listened to their praise, Aunt Lee reminisced with a smile. "The first time I saw her, she was 5 years old. Her parents brought her over next door, dressed in a pink tutu, smiling sweetly as her mother presented us with a neighborly gift. I remember thinking at the time why I didn't have a daughter like her." In such moments, I knew better than to speak. Simply remain silent and smile appropriately. During dinner, Patrick and Carolina returned. Patrick likely realized I was there, so he didn't appear surprised and gave me a nod. However, Carolina turned pale upon seeing me, her distress evident. She forced a smile and greeted Aunt Lee. "Mom, happy birthday." Aunt Lee gave her a frosty look and remained silent. Instead, she took my hand and led me to the dining area, saying, "Good girl, come sit with Auntie." At that point, it was clear something was wrong. The tension peaked during the meal as all the dishes before me were ones I used to adore. Aunt Lee introduced each dish with a pained expression. "You poor child, you must have had a tough time abroad. You've lost so much weight. Try this clear soup with bird's nest. It was your favorite when you were little. Every time Patrick upset you, he'd use this dish to soothe you." She continued, "Lou, our head chef, knew it was for you, so he started soaking the bird's nest 4 or 5 days in advance. Try it and see if it still tastes the same." Suddenly, a loud crash interrupted her words. I looked up to see Carolina, perhaps flustered or nervous, had knocked over her plate. A servant moved to clean it, but Carolina insisted on handling it herself, crouching with a napkin and apologizing frantically. I'm sorry. As she bent to clean up, Patrick grabbed her hand, halting her. He looked at her coldly and demanded, "Enough. Look at yourself. What are you doing?" Turning to the servant beside him, he ordered, "Housekeeper, clean this up." Aunt Lee was clearly furious, breathing heavily. I heard her mutter, "What a disgrace, what a disgrace. Thank goodness it's just family here and the doors are closed." She then turned to me and said, "Sophia, just look at this." She must have been deeply upset because she didn't hold back, directly addressing Carolina. "If Patrick had married you, none of this would have happened." Clutching her chest, likely feeling the sting of her anger, she grabbed my hand and spoke impulsively. "Sophia, I remember you used to love Patrick so much. This foolish boy hurt you, but the past is like the wind. Can you forgive him? For Auntie's sake, can you forgive him this once?" The dining room fell into complete silence, so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. All eyes were on me, including Patrick's. He showed no reaction to his mother's words spoken in front of his wife, simply looking at me quietly as if awaiting my response. Carolina fled the room in tears, and no one pursued her. I slowly set my chopsticks on the table, smiled, and addressed Aunt Lee. "Auntie, you didn't throw a grand party for your birthday, yet you invited me, and I'm very happy. You loved me the most when I was a child. Even after Patrick betrayed me, I never forgot your kindness. Today is your birthday, and as your junior, I want to do my best to make you happy. But the question you just asked is really difficult to answer." I paused, gracefully smiled, and met everyone's gaze before finally saying, "Auntie, I'm sorry, but I returned this time to introduce my boyfriend to my family. I'm getting engaged, and since you've watched me grow up, I hope you can be there to witness my happiness." The room remained silent. Aunt Lee looked at me in shock, and after a long pause asked, Why haven't I heard anything about this?" She hesitated before continuing. "Which family's young man is so lucky?" Lowering my eyes, I replied, "David, the eldest son of the Sioux family." I heard a sharp intake of breath, and Aunt Lee was speechless for a long time. It was Patrick's aunt who broke the silence, smiling. "Now that's a well-matched pair, a perfect union. Sophia is truly blessed." I simply smiled without responding. Patrick looked at me, his face devoid of emotion but his eyes complex. After a lengthy pause, he offered a small, self-mocking smile and said, "Congratulations." I nodded gracefully and returned his smile. "Thank you." Matters concerning the Lee family eventually came to a close, and Aunt Lee ceased contacting me. I heard she had spent some time in the hospital again. The last time I saw Carolina was at my gallery. I was conversing with Jessica when my assistant informed me that someone wanted to purchase one of my paintings at a high price, but wished to speak with me first. When I went outside, I saw Carolina standing in front of one of my artworks. As footsteps approached, she turned to face me. It was odd. My perception of her had always been that of a timid, awkward person who never knew how to handle herself. But when it was just the two of us, all that nervousness and anxiety vanished, replaced by a deep-seated hatred. She looked at me and asked, "Sophia, you're watching my downfall, aren't you?" I laughed. "Honestly, I have so much to do every day and meet so many people. I don't have time to focus on someone I never really cared about." I responded calmly, saying, "You're overcomplicating things." She glanced at me, then unexpectedly covered her face and began to weep. "Do you realize Patrick is intending to divorce me? I overheard him speaking with a divorce attorney. He no longer wants me. I can't comprehend why. You're about to get engaged, so why would he seek a divorce from me? What did I do wrong? My only mistake is my background. I lack the family and education you have. Everyone thinks I'm a joke and that I don't belong, but how is that my fault? I wanted to be like you too, to come from a distinguished family and be admired by everyone, but I wasn't born into such a family. You enjoy a better life simply because of where you were born. If we had started on equal footing, I wouldn't be in this humiliating predicament. If you were in my place, you'd end up where I am now. In the end, it's all because of your family." She cried bitterly, but luckily, no one else was in the gallery at that moment. I didn't want to engage with her, but she clearly wouldn't leave until she had finished her tears. I realized she had been holding in these thoughts and frustrations for a long time and needed to release them somewhere, even if it was to me. I thought about how humble and eager to please she used to be at the Lee family's home and sighed. I said, "Carolina, you're mistaken. If I were in your shoes, I wouldn't be in your current situation. First, I recall your grades were outstanding back then. If I were you, I wouldn't have stayed at the Lee family's home after graduating from university, depending on them for support. I would have leveraged their connections and resources to start my own business. Second, you mentioned your family is poor, and you didn't receive the same education as I did. If I were you, after marrying Patrick, I would have learned social etiquette, how to interact with people, and how to dress appropriately. I would have observed more, listened more, and spoken less. But unfortunately, you've been married to Patrick for nearly 2 years, and compared to 7 years ago, I haven't seen any improvement in you. Third, I wouldn't have allowed my entire family to blatantly and shamelessly drain the Lee family. Your family is supposed to be your support system, but instead, they're like parasites clinging to the Lee family. How can you expect them to respect you?" I couldn't explain why I was interfering, or why I even took the time to advise Carolina. Maybe it was because of how she had nervously stood on the podium all those years ago, striving so hard to fit into a new environment and carve out her own path through learning and hard work. But seeing her now, I didn't know what to say. Carolina lowered her hands from her face, her tear-streaked visage clearly visible. She was still sobbing, but it was as if a drowning person had spotted a lifeline. Her eyes brightened slightly as she asked, If I follow your advice now, is there still hope?" She truly felt hopeless. Her last shred of hope in the Lee family depended entirely on Patrick's love, and now that even Patrick wanted to leave her, attempting to do what she should have done 2 years ago was already too late. I looked at her with pity, thinking it might as well be a good deed for my own peace of mind. I suggested, "You mentioned Patrick is already consulting a divorce lawyer. Carolina, if I were you, I would take the initiative to file for divorce. You have a prenuptial agreement with Patrick, and if the Lee family sees that you're sensible and know when to back down, they might feel guilty and offer you some additional compensation." She shook her head, laughing and crying simultaneously, looking at me. No, Sophia Jing. There's still hope for Patrick and me. We can still make it." After saying this, she turned and hurried away, likely to make one last attempt to salvage her marriage. Jessica emerged from behind me and said, "I thought you despised her." I turned back and smiled at Jessica. I never saw her as a rival. I just pity her situation. She treated Patrick as the ultimate trump card to change her destiny. She seized the chance and married him, but she forgot that her greatest advantage should have been consistently and continuously investing in herself. Life is shaped by the ongoing choices we make. What we call fate is the outcome of all the decisions we've made over time. Carolina blames everything on her background, but she's mistaken. She ended up where she is today because at every crossroads in life, she made the wrong choices. I later learned that the Lee family's divorce was prolonged because Carolina refused to agree to it. It became a noisy and embarrassing spectacle, and everyone in our circle found it amusing on several occasions. Eventually, the commotion subsided, and how it was ultimately resolved remained unknown to outsiders. A year later, when I became engaged, the Lee family attended the celebration. I saw Patrick with his fiancée, the daughter of a renowned CEO who owned a chain of cake shops. They were a perfect match, both coming from prestigious families. Everyone was smiling and congratulating Patrick. They stood together, sharing common topics of conversation, and no one made any inappropriate remarks that could cause embarrassment. Carolina, who had married into high society only to become a subject of ridicule, was never mentioned. She vanished from our social circle completely, as if she had never been part of it. Everything was elegant and graceful. As I held a glass of champagne and watched everyone dancing in the garden, my fiancé approached, placed his hand on my shoulder, and tenderly asked, "What are you thinking about?" I smiled and replied, "Nothing.